My name is Leon Rodrigues. I'm the Chief Diversity Officer for the Minnesota State Colleges and Universities. Well, I think the first thing is I share a legacy with many other South Africans, having lived under apartheid oppression in South Africa. And I moved to the United States after South Africa's political settlement, just to find that in the United States people still struggle with race, people still struggle with oppression, people still struggle with discrimination. And I work in an organization where I think we deal with a lot of the residual effects of that era of racism, of segregation. And we need to transform our organizations to be inclusive, to value and validate the presence of those whose value may at some point in history been questioned or even subjugated. And our organizations need to be more inclusive of that. So when you talk about transformation, I think it starts off with ourselves. We are born human if we prefer to believe that, but there are processes in society and the way society has been socially constructed that tell us we are less human. For example, we could not vote. We were disenfranchised. We could not apply for the same jobs as everybody else. We could not live in certain neighborhoods. There was a time we could not even get education, which meant that we were not good enough or inferior, or we just had less value. Also acknowledging the pain, the hurt, the abuse that we have to overcome, that we have been affected by that, and that we need to reclaim the fact that we have value, and that we should not allow those things to hold us back. Unfortunately, today we still see people dealing with internalized racial oppression. We see people subjected to hegemony, so thinking that they cannot make a contribution or that their contribution is not acceptable. In order to oppress or to regard somebody as inferior, you have to have a very defunct view of who you are. And it's actually a lack of your own humanity if you believe that somebody is not fully human as you are. In order to hurt somebody and to abuse somebody, you also have to put aside those deeply inherent human qualities about caring and compassion, and in order to continue that oppression, you have to certainly put that aside. One thing I have been working on over the past few years is also dealing with trauma. But when I think about trauma, I also think about the bystander. The bystander is also traumatized. So what did it mean for people watching the civil rights marches and watching people getting shot and tear-gassed and chased down with dogs? What did it mean for those? It also traumatized those people. And so they too need to think about how do they get healing and how do they overcome that trauma. So the first thing I would say is we need to create the spaces where we can tell our stories, where both the traumatized and those bystanders can tell those stories. I think it was Dr. King that said in one of his eloquent statements was he looks forward to the day when the children of former slaves and former slave owners can sit at the table together. That means dealing with that trauma. That means doing something in order to sit at the table together. And if we look at our workplaces today, we are still pretty much separated. And unfortunately, when we are not intentional about that, we tend to suppress that generation upon generation, and that leads to dysfunction and that leads to pathology. And if not dealt with, it comes out in ways that we least expect it, and maybe in ways that might be much, much more complex to deal with. So my daily undertaking in my organization is to create more intentionality, to create more validity for this kind of discussion, and also for people to learn to engage with each other. You know, everybody talks about diversity, everybody talks about inclusion, but only to a limited point. We are thinking more about authentic engagement. And what does that mean? It means accepting each other with all of the baggage and being prepared to work through that so that we can move from what I would call pseudo-community to more authentic community. As a young activist, I was very angry. I was deeply resentful. I saw how my parents had been treated by ordinary people on the street, ordinary privileged white people in South Africa, and I struggled with that. I felt the need to assert myself, and if I needed to use other means, I would get back at them by any means necessary. I've learned great lessons from people like Mahatma Gandhi, who has a great legacy in South Africa, as well as Dr. Martin Luther King, who had the philosophy of nonviolence, and I firmly believe in that. I feel deeply within the human spirit is something like compassion, and it is compassion for those in need. And we might not always all have material need. We might have other needs, some psychological needs, a need to be loved and to love someone else. And that's what I find we need to develop in our society as we overcome some of these differences. Of course, the first layer that people always resort to is anger. When we think about the stages of grief, when we're confronted with a very stark reality, we have to allow people to get through that so that the real work can actually happen. And that's what I do on a daily basis as a practitioner in my organization. Raise awareness, and secondly, challenge people to action, and a much deeper action. And I've talked a lot about individual action. I'm a firm believer also in collective action.